Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
Rob, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I was exposed to your work first, I think on modern wisdom. That's where I stumbled upon your ideas, and that quickly led me down a couple more of your interviews. And I really like the way you think from an evolutionary lens. And it's a field that I stumbled upon through Godsod and through Jonathan Haidt a few years ago, maybe 5 or 10 years ago. I started looking at life through an evolutionary lens myself. So I thought it'd be fun to learn from you today and share some of your ideas with the world.
And I appreciate that. Yeah. So those are some guys in the area. My particular background, I came in on the to be Cosby side. So I don't know how down the rabbit hole you've gotten for evolutionary approaches, but just like every academic community, there's little pockets here and there. So some people talk about the Santa Barbara school. So my perspective comes from that side of the world there.
I'm curious, like from someone from the outside, like myself, and most people listening, what does that mean to you? Like, what kind of paradigm is that? Like a differential paradigm when it comes from the educational background?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I think from someone from the outside, I think it's like everything else. The differences don't really matter all that much. You know what I mean? It's much more important inside the field. There's a few things that do matter. So, for example, people like John Haidt, they were sort of born into the world as social psychologists. John actually was here at Penn. I say here because I'm in Philadelphia. And he came to the discipline as sort of like asking the question, how could some of our social psychology questions be informed from some of these evolutionary ideas? And Paul Rozin played a big role in that. Whereas for someone like me, it's more like I started with evolutionary psychology and said, is social behavior one of the things that we can look at with these tools? So it winds up in many of the same places. The other big difference is, I think the big difference is cognition. So where I went to school, the big tool other than evolution was the computational theory of mind, which does change your perspective a little bit. So like Steve Pinker and How the Mind Works completely embraces this. When you think about the mind as a computational device, then you get slightly different flavors of
I see.
Work. Yeah.
So it's almost a little bit more grounded in a way of scientific thinking, and you get less into the weeds of the spirituality and the subjective. Is that somewhat of the difference too?
Well, I think those guys would kill me if I claimed our approach was more scientific, but it definitely draws more heavily on cognitive science and the computational theory of mind. Again, take a John Haidt. So his inspiration, which, by the way, I have absolute, just complete respect for John Haidt. A lot of his insight came from the cross-cultural work. So, he was introduced to a lot of interesting cross-cultural ideas, particularly from India and elsewhere. And so it's one way to think about it is he was looking at it in terms of like, how can these ideas explain variation? Whereas something that I'm interested in is how can we explain universals? So that also shifts perspective a little. Don't get me wrong. Those are both super important questions, in my opinion, and both can be approached scientifically. But one is, if you've got a human nature, what's the sort of like the grand, vast outcomes that you can wind up with in that sort of cultural approach? And then if you're looking at human universals, you're saying, okay, what is it that's in common to all humanity? And then you can start saying, and how does that manifest itself in different locations and different times?
Yeah, I like that. And looking at the commonalities is so important, and the differences is so important. So they're both great to look at. But I'm curious what got you into this field. I mean, it's a pretty strict, it's not like a ton of people get loped into this field.
Yeah, it's still small, which is a little puzzling. I was, when I did my undergraduate, I was at Cornell, and I was into biology. And back then, it became pretty clear that evolutionary biology was allowed to be sort of applied to every species except for humans. And, one of my I think it's interesting origin story is I saw David Buss, another sort of location, what a brand in evolutionary psychology. He gave a talk And I went to the talk because I was already interested in this question: how does evolution inform social behavior? This was shortly after he wrote his famous paper looking at mating preferences in 37 different cultures. Huge hit, very important work. And he gave this talk, and at the end of it, a faculty member, it was Sandy Bem, I remember to this day, she gets up, which is unusual in academic talk, and she says, David, everything you've explained with evolution, I can explain with culture. And David starts to answer this, and she says, you've had your turn, now I'm going to have mine. And this caught my attention. I was like, oh, this is an interestingly contentious field. And so I already liked evolutionary biology. I was super interested in human social behavior. I spent a lot of time as a kid reading science fiction, and so I learned from those books that the scientists are always the people who save the world, galaxy, or universe. And I was like, I want to do that. And all of those pieces came together, and I was like, okay, there's this scientific way to look at human social behavior, starting with evolutionary biology, and we can apply it to humans, and it's super contentious, which fits my character. I was like, I would like to do that. And at the time, there were two big labs I was aware of. David Buss was running one of them, and then Santa Barbara with 2B Cosby's is the other. At the time, David was at Michigan. And so I applied to everywhere I could, and I only got into one place, which turned out, in my opinion, to be kind of the best place at Santa Barbara. And that's really it. So it was a combination of my love of evolutionary biology. I grew up reading fun books by Stephen Jay Gould, and I read sociobiology, and then I had that experience at Cornell, and I was like, yeah, I want to be a part of this. I want to learn this. I want to do this.
It's amazing. I'm sure there's still a lot of pushback and a lot of confliction in that field, but just especially the way the world is right now. We're so divided, it seems, and the social media and all of the amplification of ideology, it seems like it's really gotten into the place of righteousness. That book that Haidt wrote, I really enjoyed that Righteous Mind book, because a lot of people right now, it's nice to try to see, like, why are we so ideologically possessed, and why are we so righteous about our ideas, and why are we so quickly driven against each other instead of trying to see underneath it all and see, like, how did we get here and what can we do to make things better? I'm curious what your ideas are around that, around righteousness and ideology right now, especially.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't be more right about the contentiousness, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that there are certain kinds of facts that are viewed with a moral lens. And the way I sort of think about it is, and I should say also my background, after I did my PhD, I spent time with economists, first with some folks at University of Arizona, Vernon Smith, sort of a behavioral economist, and then Colin Cameron at Caltech. And that has really that shaped how I think about the world. So I often think about the games that we play. So if I'm thinking about a particular belief, adopting one or not, there's two real key ways in which I can get payoffs from that belief. One is I can get it correct, which can be helpful, right? So if you know where the ham sandwich is and you're correct, then you can get it, and you can, if you're hungry, you can. But there's a lot of beliefs that really cost me a lot if I endorse them, because people evaluate me for my group membership based on these kinds of beliefs. So, as you were talking, I was thinking about this recent controversy about the extent to which men and women hunted and gathered over human evolutionary time, which to my read doesn't really look all that controversial, but it exploded, and part of that was ideological. The underlying piece was we don't kind of want it to be true that there were these reliable sex roles. We want human nature to be a blank slate, and it plays into a narrative of egalitarianism. I don't endorse that argument, because I feel like, look, I don't care what the history is. We should let people do whatever they want. But my point simply is, in science, you're supposed to only care about the payoff to get the fact right, but that's not the way the real world is. There's another payoff to choosing the fact that corresponds to what your little group believes. So you got to weigh those, right? Like, well, what do I care more about, getting it right or being in the right tribe, team, squad, group, gang, whatever words you want to use? And now, and this is, I think, the payoff to your point, is that, man, the incentives to adopt the proper beliefs in the current world, because social media means everyone knows what you think. Social media means everyone can gang up on you if you've got the wrong belief, if you don't post the right black square or the right flag of the right country. So I think it's important to think about beliefs as having these payoffs. And I wish it were true that in science, people always care most about the the truth payoff. But look, scientists are human. They care about what the other people think, and if that means adopting a belief they kind of think isn't true.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to be tricky to get the average people in the world to start looking at the world through an evolutionary lens is an interesting idea in itself. And to try to implement that into a culture that's got so many different beliefs that butt up against that and almost get offended when you start to think about the world in this way. I'm just curious how that could even happen,
Yeah.
especially now with echo chambers the way they are. Um, but yeah, I could see the virtue signaling taking off to a certain degree because of what you just said. It's like that's what everybody's actually signaling for their own self-interest, is to just portray that I stand for this or I stand for that, and here's my flag or my square or whatever the thing is, but it's not what they actually think behind the screen. And so people are unwilling to actually tell the truth, speak the truth, or even seek to understand more about the truth because they just want to hurry up and feel good.
I totally agree, and I think that last point you made is super important about what kinds of truth you seek, because this also influences what is acceptable in terms of scientific questions that are being asked. I mean, I don't want to get too deep into it, but of course, this intersects with questions about genetics, and there's certain kinds of questions about genetics and group differences which are, I think the word taboo applies. I think they really are taboo in the sense that people see you as asking those questions, and therefore that has this very strong moral weight. And I do think this is a problem, and I don't myself have ideas about great solutions because, you know, when I was at Santa Barbara, I remember telling John Tooby, my advisor, I said, look, these ideas are so powerful, just that evolution constrains hypotheses so much that we're going to be done with the field because everyone's going to adopt these tools and we're just going to be done. So, like, how can I have a career? Because, 10 years down, and he laughed, a belly laugh. And unfortunately, John Tooby passed away recently, so we can't enjoy his laughter. But I'll never forget that laugh. And in some ways, I mean, I think that was the most naive things I think I've ever said. And it's to your point that, look, if you can't even pick up the tools to use the instruments that are going to help guide your search for facts and findings and discoveries, then it's going to take a minute. And I do think in many ways the social sciences have just completely failed in their promise. I mean, I like asking people, what does social science say about questions such as what's the best form of government? How should people organize themselves? Which, maybe that's a hard question, but another hard question is what's the relationship between energy and matter? That's a pretty tough question, but we figured out Einstein got that one, but political science still haven't quite figured out how to organize ourselves. There's no way. So I think the social sciences, in many ways, I think we have so far to go, and it's not helping that there's tools that people aren't willing to use.
Yeah, absolutely. And you ended up writing, what, 2 books now? You co-wrote a book, and I'd love to get into, because if you spent that much energy and time writing a book, which has to be quite a feat, what was the reason for writing that one book about hypocrisy? And I'd
Yeah,
love to hear some of the scaffolding and help people to just get some of the cliff notes, at least, of that, including myself.
sure. Yeah, I mean, it's never hard to get me to talk about or any author to talk about their book. So, one of the things about academic writing is that in most cases you're very constrained in length because editors and scholarly journals are jealous of how much, space they'll allot you. So a book is a nice way to sort of get a bunch of ideas out there with much less editorial, not that there's none, interference. So the Hypocrite book, Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite, was supposed to build a whole argument starting from scratch, the evolutionary point of view that gets you all the way to hypocrisy. And so I wanted to start out with real simple things. So for example, I start out with optical illusions. So in optical illusions, you're looking at two circles and you have been told and you believe, and you can then show yourself that they're the same size. So one part of your brain has a belief, these are the same size. And then your visual system is looking at them and it's like, they're different. And so this motivates the idea that it's completely natural for brains to have two completely contradictory beliefs, we call them representations in cognitive science, at the same time. This is really important because what that tells us is something about the architecture of the mind, is that it's not a big, conglomeration of stuff that distills one belief. Each little section can have its own beliefs. And I try to build that argument, starting all the way from optical illusions into, some questions about, higher level things, preferences, strategies, to try to illustrate that's not just visual, that's everywhere. So you might have some belief about what is correct, morally correct in your head and legitimately have that belief. And then your behavioral system might do that very thing. So you have one system that likes to do X, whatever it is. You have another system that says X is bad. And the reason that those can coexist, and in my view, that's hypocrisy, is that it's because different parts are in control at different times. And there's all this stuff you don't even know about. You don't even know. So the agenda of the book is to say, look, let's start right at the beginning and say, look, you've got optical illusions and you've got here's how the mind works. And then you can get these different kinds of beliefs, different kinds of preferences, and they can all exist at the same time. And that can give you massive amounts of inconsistency in our own behavior. That's really the agenda that I was after there. The moral piece was interesting, important to me. I mean, like many authors, I smuggled in some stuff in the last chapter because there's a very thinly veiled defense of a libertarian worldview at the end. And the intuition that I kind of go with is, look, and this a lot of it was, by the way, influenced by John Haidt. So what John Haidt showed was that you've got these very strong moral intuitions and you can't explain where they come from, right? So he has the famous story about the two kids, they engage in consensual incest. And there's no pregnancy and everyone's happy and people say it's morally wrong and they say why and you're like, I don't know. And they don't know. So what I want to say about the libertarian agenda is there's lots of things that you condemn. And that's being driven by some modular system in your head that's sitting there going like, that guy's bad. I'm going to get Ryan. He's a bad guy for doing X. But that moral module might not be at all related to what your actual beliefs are. And so that's why you can't really defend them. So that's sort of the agenda. The agenda was to go all the way from low level to hypocrisy and then a little bit of just leave people alone as long as they don't hurt anyone at the very end.
Right. And to see just how different we all are based on so many variables. And it seems like through your lens and most evolutionary psychological lenses, it's like there has to be a reason that we adapted those traits along the line somewhere. Even if we can't quite find it, that evolutionary lens is always helpful to me, at least, to think, well, at some there was a reason to find tribalism to be so advantageous, or righteousness, or to be ideologically possessive. It's like these are all traits that probably served us, which is why they're still inside of the chain. And then maybe it just doesn't quite work so well when we amplify them with social media or the way cities are designed, or maybe when you just have too much of a large population, then they start really butting up against each other. Is that correct?
Yeah, totally. And so you're pointing to, I think, an issue that is appreciated but sort of underexplored. So this is something that my friend and co-author on Living Fossils, where we put a lot of, that's where the Substack where we're putting a lot of our written work now. He talks a lot about mismatch and how the modern era presents environments where these, ancient emotions, which were adaptive, are not doing us any favors. I always like the example of road rage just because everyone's experienced it, where, as much as we don't want to say it, anger must have been an adaptive emotion, right? So like you come over and you sort of smack me in the face. I'm going to get angry and I'm going to do something because I don't want you to do that again tomorrow, right? And I don't want Fred over there to do it. So I have to have a motivational system that causes me to react in such a way that I provide some deterrence so you don't do it again. That's what anger is. Anger is a deterrent emotion. It's like, okay, well, signal that you're not going to let that happen again or whatever it is. But in a world, and that's great for a world in which everyone knows everyone. Makes sense, right? Because everyone can learn from my behavior. Like, oh, Rob's a guy who, takes revenge. But in the modern world where, someone cuts me off on a freeway and I'm really angry with that person, even though that might not have been intentional, any action I take to impose cost on that person, that's a bad idea, right? There's nothing good that's going to come out of that. So this ancient emotion of deterrence, which works in a setting of known individuals, does us no favors in a world of unknown. That's just one example of mismatch where you've got an ancestral emotion, anger. Just as you say. So I'm going to take 1 second to pitch. You mentioned 2 books. I'm working on a third right now, which is called Phenomenal. And so the argument is exactly the one you made, which is that every feeling we have, from hunger to the need to breathe to boredom to fear to love to jealousy, those all had some function. And we can use the evolutionary lens to figure out what it is, to motivate us to do something. And I just want to get all of them. So I'm trying to think about, every single one. And each one has a function. And then you could ask, well, how's it doing in the modern world? Is it doing what its job? Is it, and other people can take advantage, right? So like all these companies that want our attention, they know that, there's systems in there which are designed, oh, I can win money. That's great. I want to win money. I have greed. That's a notion I have, and so forth.
It's very interesting. And even the driving of cars and thinking about how fast tech has boomed in the last 100 years, 50 years, it's like people often say we weren't designed to be here in this type of experience. And I think, well, maybe we evolved. We weren't designed. And it's complexity over time and intelligence over time. And who's to say what our environment we're limited to? Does that make sense? It's like, were we designed? People say we weren't designed to have this tech. It's too much for our brain. And I'm thinking, well, we wouldn't have it then. Maybe we weren't supposed to get into small groups and have just a small group of people organizing where the tech goes. I think that's more of what we should look at, right? It's like who's creating the tech and with what interests, and maybe they have too much centralized power. Maybe those are the bigger questions instead of thinking that tech is the issue. It's like, no, we probably can keep evolving with this tech exponentially if we have a relationship to it where it's ethical to some degree and we think of the outcomes and don't just keep ramping forward. I'm just curious. I'd like to get into some of the technology talk with your lens, thinking about AI and social media companies and censorship and all this stuff, because there's so much around that right now. This is our time, and it's important for people like myself and everyone at this time to start thinking like, how can we think about this differently, including myself?
Such important questions. I usually come back on this question. I think I like to start with food, because humans have this evolved appetitive system, which, simplifying greatly, more or less works in such a way that it says, look, if you can see or smell some really good calorie package, you should eat it, because, in ancestral environments, much of the time, we don't really know, much of the time, we were probably living right up against what we needed. That many anthropologists think that. There's some debate about the topic. And so in some sense, you have these evolved preferences, and they're pretty sticky. I mean, they're pretty sticky, right? No one's going to grow up and be like, I just can't wait to eat another Brussels sprout. They're going to say, I want chocolate. And this, I think, intersects a little bit with your point about responsibility. The thing is that we've organized markets so that the companies that give us the thing that we want to eat, that hits our preference systems at a good price, we're going to consume those. So, we've offloaded the question of which products are we going to have into more or less these preferences, because they're just rewarding the companies that feed them cheaply. And that is, and that argument extends all the way up to social media, right? So like the like button. Oh, it turns out people really want social feedback, that they've done something which their social world values. Let's put a like button in there. And that, as you know, changed the world. And this is where I admit, I'm a free market guy, so it's difficult for me to try to thread that needle. On the one hand, I think companies should be able to produce products, holding aside various constraints about labor and so on. But what does that give you? Well, that gives you sort of the lowest common denominator, right? That gives you whatever feeds human preferences, and that's going to get produced. And then what happens? Well, and this is, again, something that John Hyde has talked a lot about, and others, which is, well, now they produce products, when the market was for food, because in the West, people were spending 50% of their budget on food, those companies got big, right? Now, when the market is attention, whoever gets your attention best, that guy gets big. You look at the Facebooks, you look at the Instagrams, you look, those guys. How do we as a society deal with that? It's a very hard question, because in this, I just do want to say your point about the time frame. The problem is that gene frequencies change slowly compared to tech changes. So our genetic makeup is not changing that fast. We have more or less. Again, there's been some good work recently which shows genetic change has been pretty fast in the last 10,000 years or so, not that fast. We're
Mm.
still basically, if you drag someone from Babylon or from ancient Egypt or from ancient Greece, whatever it is, Samaria, eh, they would look pretty much the same with, few, whatever this would be. So
Hmm.
I, that just because genes are not changing that fast, whereas the tech is. So it's a hard problem.
Sure is. And I'm like you in a way of more libertarian oriented. Less regulation seems better because the people that regulate it ends up usually being more problematic and it becomes a giant silo of money. And we've seen what big government does, especially right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's hard to know because externalizing instead of having our genes evolve so slowly, like you said, it's almost like tech really is the extended nervous system, the extended mind. And instead of waiting these millions of years, we've just created the internet and now we have telepathy and we have other abilities to travel through space and time instead of having to run so fast. But it's like, yeah, how do we regulate it so that people don't just try to rape your attention or your hardware by making the most addictive foods without, letting it go off the rails? It's almost like people should have to be at least honest about what they're doing behind the screen. And there should be more forthright conversation around like how these, maybe not regulatory issues, but more of like just full on honesty of what you're representing. But
I agree with that. Yeah. So there's a one answer that libertarians have to this issue is exactly what you're saying, which is you could regulate disclosure. It's just tricky because in the modern world, if you say, well, you got to disclose your algorithm, the company's gonna be like, no, that's my secret sauce. I don't want to tell anyone that. Like that, you're destroying my business, and they have some justice in that. So, and the same thing, of course, this is why I think food is such an interesting analogy because that was one of the things that happened. Is people were consuming all sorts of stuff, and eventually the state did step in and say, well, you got to say what the ingredients are. And then you got to give some estimate of what the nutrient balance is in there. And I think that was good. Like, I'm in favor of that. Like, I'm in favor of consumers having good information. It's just so tricky because, I don't know, I have a close friend back from my grad school days. I like the way he puts it. He's like, look, Rob, you can't expect people to deal with technology all that well because 20 minutes ago, you and we were monkeys throwing our feces in a tree. And so it's, it just wasn't that long ago. And so what do you expect from me? I'm just a monkey, and that's not exactly right. But I think it's a nice lesson, which is, there's a nice perspective. There's some wisdom there, which is what do you expect? Particularly if you let capitalism go on, right? You let companies just keep trying little stuff and say, oh, which one do they go for? And then they hit one. They're like, let's do that. And then the audience is just like, I don't know. It's great. I liked it. I'm going to do more of that. And then you get behemoths, right, who are just really good at giving you exactly what you wanted. And it is a tough problem. I'm on balance an optimistic guy, but man, I think one way to think about it again is if you look at the kind of pushback that John's gotten and try and get phones out of schools. I mean, he's had some success there, but people don't like giving up their phones. They want to see what the latest thing is on X, or they want to see the latest video. I'm not a social media guy, so I don't know what the thread. I don't know. They don't, because that feeds their little preference system, right? They get their little dopamine hit. They're like, oh, Johnny liked my picture of me with a swan. I want to know that. That's fun to know.
Yeah. I love the work he's trying to do with that because you're like, this is a young mind that's being completely raped for their attention. And the outcome we haven't even seen to the full degree of like this epidemic of attention capture and what it's going to do to their brain development and their social environments. And it's going to get really nasty before it gets better, I think. But I'm an optimist as well. Like, I love the humbling perspective that you took, which is like we were just throwing feces at each other and we were just there. And I like to do that myself to the best of my abilities. Like, look, we're doing pretty good too. Like, it's surprising that we're not just all mad in the streets and losing our minds and just raping and pillaging, because it could be way worse in the West, at least, because it is really bad in certain places. But I do like thinking how you just said. That's nice. It's humbling. It's probably good to do more often than not. Is to go, look how far we've come so fast.
Right. And on the same note, I like this way that Rob Boyd at UCLA used to put it. He's like, look, we put 200, 250, 300 people in a metal tube every day. If you put 200, 250 metal people and chimpanzees in a metal tube on any day, almost all of them are going to die. They are just going to kill each other.
Yeah.
And they're just all right. So yeah, so we do okay, Elon Musk's going to put someone on Mars, and iPhones are cool, and we're pretty good with our hands. And a lot of the time, civilization is pretty civilized. I mean, again, so you take a look at like a Steve Pinker and Better Angels and so on, saying we're getting a little better. I think our attention is drawn, not surprisingly, right to the times, whatever, to the violence and the conflict and the places we're not doing as well. And as you say, I think also it can be misleading because you don't always see the long-term effects of what's been going on. I've noticed that there's a certain age of people, slightly younger than me, that don't seem to be able to do only one thing at a time. I predict that if you had a Zoomer on here, I don't know if there's evidence on this, that they're kind of doing something else while they're having the conversation. Maybe they're checking their email, or these days checking. And that, I wonder about that. Like, I wonder what is it going to do in the long run to have people who don't really focus on one thing at a time. Maybe nothing. Maybe it's good. Maybe people get more things done. But man, sometimes it seems hard to know. You know what I mean?
Oh, I agree. Yeah, and I've even heard, I don't know who said it, but when you start including these DEI trainings and you start making companies, engineering companies, fire department companies doing things from the social sciences, but then it takes the attention away from the infrastructural and the more practical engineering side of things. It takes years for us to find out where that went wrong. In the real
Yeah.
time, it's like, okay, this is fine and it's going well, but it's like the bridges don't collapse for 20 years or 10 years, I don't remember who brought that up, but it's like we're in the middle of this exponential technological revolution and we don't know what we're doing. It's happening so fast. And so it's
Yeah.
going to be interesting to see how we get ourselves out of it as an evolved creature. Can we evolve with it and adapt and overcome and make the changes we need to make, hopefully? Um,
Yeah.
I'd love to
That's a
ask
great.
you a little bit about human sexuality and monogamy and what your thoughts are around the evolution of that train, where we
Yeah.
came from, where we're at now, and what your thoughts are on how people can be considering monogamous relationships and marriage and all these things in a world of dating apps and porn and all the other crap that's going on.
Yes, so hard. Right. So where I am on this is that, there's a lot of animals. I mean, birds are the best example where they're sort of obligate monogamous, where, you have a bird, a swan, and barring strange circumstances, they're going to mate for life. Penguins are like this. They mate switch every now and then, but that's basically their shtick. And then you have some birds that, if you're a male bird and you're high mate value male bird because you're sort of big and you can control the big territory, in a really, in a good season, you can have more than one mate because your territory size allows you to get enough to provision more than one mate. So you have two different strategies you can pursue, monogamy or polygamy, depending on the circumstances. I think humans are pretty much like that. There's these different strategies that we adopt, and they are constrained by ecological factors, so like how much stuff is out in the world. And then the big one, which is the moral environment, right? So if polygamy is punished or illegal or both or whatever, then you just throw that strategy out. Same thing with, same-sex relationships. And I think for whatever reason, there's people who have same-sex preferences. Fine. Nothing wrong with that, as Seinfeld says. But in some contexts, you get killed for having that. So human sexual strategies, it seems to me, are pretty flexible, right? Now, in terms of, the way to think about, I always think about anyone who's, in any kind of mating arrangement, whether it's polygamy or monogamy or whatever, humans are really good at computing opportunity costs. What is the cost of doing, the cost of doing whatever I'm doing now is whatever I'm not doing. And much of the time, whatever the benefit of that other thing is not big enough to get you to change, right? So you're like, oh, keep doing this. It's pretty good. The problem with porn and the dating apps is that it makes the opportunity cost loom larger. Like on the apps, there's always a chance of a super attractive mate who's right around the corner. So if you do think that our psychology is keyed into opportunity costs, then the worst possible thing you can do for stable relationships is continuing to kind of throw the possibility of a better one at them. I suspect that's one of the things that's going on. This intersects a little bit with your point earlier about AI. I'm particularly concerned about what does the world look like with these AI boyfriend girlfriends, who is, you can contrive to make look exactly the way you want your partner to look. Eventually, you'll be able to onboard them with the personality of whatever you want, someone who's kind and supportive and maybe fun or edgy or even whatever. It doesn't require anything in terms of the cost that people pay in relationships, including, loyalty, but certainly, support. So, you could say, well, it's not a real relationship. And I'm like, well, people drink diet soda. The reason diet soda tastes good is because we have these receptors for sugar, blah, blah, dopamine. And then it's not like they realize, oh, I'm not really getting any calories. No, they still drink it because it tastes good. So I think that AI girlfriends, boyfriends are the diet soda mating, but they're like the crack cocaine version of them. I mean, I don't know if you ever played with these things, but I just can imagine. And I don't even want to talk about what happens when you upload them into like a robot that has appropriate features. So yeah, so my view on human sexuality is it's flexible, it's contingent, it depends on the moral environment, the ecological environment. We're quite flexible in that respect. Don't get me wrong. I mean, when you take classes in evolutionary psychology, one of the lessons in mating is looking at the ratio of testicle size to body size, because in the animal kingdom, that's a really good metric of polygamy. So like, chimpanzees have a high ratio, whereas there's species, capuchins have a relatively low. So like humans are in the middle somewhere. So like we're sort of slightly polygamous. And that tracks, right? Like, if you look at human cultures today, a lot of them are monogamous, not all of them. And even in polygamous cultures, you got some people who are highly interested. But yeah, the opportunity cost piece, that's tough. Once you get tempted away, I mean, in 20 years, I would not be willing to bet about how many people are like, if I'm in a relationship with a flesh and blood person, I've got to worry about their feelings. Maybe I got to worry about supporting them. But, with something that I'm getting a lot of what I need from a relationship out of, who's an AI, I'm like, huh? 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 You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's very strange. I hope that we don't go too far that path, but then again, it's not up to me to decide. I can choose myself what I'd prefer, but
Yeah.
even porn and stuff, it's like the moral thing isn't the problem for me as much as it is just the psychological impact that it would have when I go to have a relationship with a real human being. I think it has a real detrimental effect. So I just try to look at it from the lens of what's going to be the best bang for my buck outcome. And it probably isn't a good idea to be stuck on your screen all the time. And, we obviously need community and real relationships to thrive. But who knows? The kids are obviously being swept into the screens earlier now than ever, and it will get weird. I'm curious what your thoughts are on free will and like Robert Sapolsky's work. I've listened to him for years, and I feel like more and more he hammers down, a lot of people do in the scientific world, on free will and how much we have or don't have. And a lot of them almost want to completely eliminate it. And what do you think about Sapolsky's work and the idea of free will?
Yeah, I try to stay away from this question in part because a lot of it, to my mind, has come down to semantics. I think it was Dennett, he also passed away recently, sadly, who said something like, look, you tell me what you mean by free will and I'll tell you whether or not we have it. But before you tell me what you mean, I can't answer the question. And so I think, as philosophers do, they tend to get bogged down. Not that Sapolsky comes from the neuroscience side, but they tend to get bogged down a little bit in the semantics. I mean, let me put it this way. Yeah, I don't see any way out of the idea that whatever I'm doing right now has a physical cause, and all those physical causes have to be deterministic in the typical way that a physicist would talk about it. So I don't know how to get out of that. That seems pretty tricky. And if you want to say that gets sort of free will, then yeah, like, okay, well, sort of eliminativism, or I've lost track of the literature. Then yeah, it seems like there's nothing left over. There's no elan vital that can do any work here. There's no spirit that's left. It's just the physics of it. Yeah, I don't know how to get out of that. That seems like a pretty hard argument to get out of. There's some kind of like just regular old got to pay the bills stuff that makes you feel like there's at least got to be some sense. So if you go too far and you say, well, why should we punish people then? Because there's no way they could have done other. well, this puts you in a weird spot because now you can't deter the stuff that now there's going to be other stuff that they do. You know what I mean? So I think from the perspective of the law, which is another one of my interests, you have to sort of maintain the fiction that there's some intention in there somewhere. There's some free will in there somewhere, because otherwise, yeah, the project falls apart. But yeah, that's where I land on that. I don't know if that's satisfying, but that's sort of my back of the envelope sketch of free will.
Yeah, I love it. I like hearing people's perspective on it, especially now more than ever, because I feel like people usually don't even pay attention to the question. Most people just walk around and it's almost like an automatic happening. And it's nice to just question yourself and be like, how much will do I have, if any? And what does that even mean? And it's a rabbit hole. And I don't want to get stuck on it too much, but I almost think it's at the foundation of being human to almost see how lucid and free you are to some degree. And it's fun to explore. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the psychedelics. There's a big boom in psychedelics right now, and the science of psychedelics for healing and trauma, but also just the evolutionary history of it and how much you've explored, how much that's shaped how we think and who we are as a species.
Yeah, just the first bit. So I looked into this briefly. One, I, so as a general matter, I don't have any moral qualms with people using recreational drugs, and I do have a problem with heavy restrictions on exploration of potential healing of these drugs, which I believe does characterize the American system for the last, countless decades. And who knows how much suffering could have been alleviated if there had been good, solid work on, these sorts of substances. Because I am impressed with some of the evidence, particularly with respect to depression, PTSD. Those seem to be the two big ones. And I think more work ought to be done with those. And it's sad to me that I guess there was a stigma, or there was concern for abuse, which, don't get me wrong. I mean, some people do need to be protected from abuse. Kids, for example, I mean, they can't make great decisions. So that makes sense to me. But my read of this current, like the most recent evidence, is it's pretty strong for example, couples, the two cases I mentioned, PTSD and major depression. As to the evolutionary story, man, I don't know. I would say, look, anytime you've got wetware, you got brains that are doing stuff, it's got to be true that there's going to be some weird way you can mess with them, right? So, like, if you get into the circuits and you throw a screwdriver in there, something weird's going to happen. Most of the time, nothing's going to happen. A lot of the time, something bad's going to happen, and then every now and then, you're going to just make something weird happen. That's sort of my view of many of these drugs. That might not turn out to be right. I think the best work on this, I think, is Ed Hagen, who's at University of Washington, and he has some really great ideas about, the role of what seem to be just recreational drugs, but they might have other sorts of uses, including suppressing pathogens and so on. So it's not exactly a coincidence that they give rise to this kind of pleasant sensation, because they have a role to do with, I think that was nicotine was the one that he was looking at, but I think there's others as well. But yeah, I mean, it would just be kind of weird if you couldn't get into just get into the neurons and give them some weird neurotransmitter boost, something strange is going to happen. You know what I mean? So those are my views. My views are, yeah, it's pretty strange. There might not be a function to it. It might just be a side effect of having to have, some kind of system. But on the therapeutic front, I do think 10, 15 years down the road, there are going to be more therapeutic options, because there seems to be a slight loosening of, the opposition to these drugs. I'm actually curious. I usually don't turn the question around, but in this case, I will. Do you have a view on this, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I do.
Yeah.
It's quite a broad view and deep view, but it's first, I think I agree with you on certain fronts of, like, yeah, we probably shouldn't be locking people in boxes for altering their consciousness. I think the government should be hands off when you're of age and your brain's developed, and that probably causes more harm than the drugs, is by putting people into boxes and then having these businesses that are built around the drug laws that don't even prevent people from doing drugs. So I think the drug war is a big mess, and it's prevented the scientific evidence from emerging and from the studies from happening. So we probably double whammied on the side of like, yeah, we've prevented people from having the healing potential of these things, but we've also locked people up for recreational use, which should be allowed.
Yeah.
Not saying, we're allowed to go to bars and we have government sanctioned drugs. So I'm more of a freedom guy. And I think that cognitive liberty is something I stand for. But education and understanding, like, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Who are you doing it with? Maybe you should be more mindful of that. But I think the pharmaceutical companies are the biggest drug dealers, right? The opioid crisis, and you look at the Sacklers and how many millions of people died because of the drugs they sanctioned and they pushed towards the culture as a medicine. And I see that being the dangerous part of this new renaissance. The
Mm.
hiccup in it is that the reason it's booming is because there's a profit incentive driven behind it. And I see it being used as pain management from the psyche. And I see it being sort of an authoritarian model. And of course, there is benefit, and they've been showing to be beneficial forever through all of human history. I think there's people that have looked at it deeply enough to go, yeah, we've been using these things for a long time. It's nothing new. But I think there's an obvious reason why they're almost being deployed at this time, but only in this one model of checking boxes for trauma, and only if done in this government sanctioned way. And I think that can be dangerous in its own right, because now you have people that are thinking it's medicine. And, we already have a ketamine epidemic emerging because ketamine was the first one that they legalized. Yes, there's some potential there, but now they're giving take-home nasal spray ketamine. And there's already tons of people, I've heard even at the last Burning Man, where people go and do recreational drugs for a long period of time, that there was a lot of ketamine addiction. And so I just feel like it's more problematic than good, unfortunately. And I feel like the more regulation we have on drugs, the more it keeps it in the hands of the cultural engineers that want to use it for their own self-interest, for profit, or for whatever their gain is. So that's some of my perspective.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah. So people don't notice it, but you mentioned the book earlier. I dedicate it to people who are deprived their liberty for pursuing happiness. And that is supposed to be a nod to, obviously the Jeffersonian line, but the idea that we're jailing people just because they want to get high. And so I agree with you. I was not aware of what you had just said. I didn't know that there were ketamine addictions. I do take the point about the regulatory. It's tough though. I have been a fairly extreme, legalization guy. But one person who turned me around on this is Rob Henderson. You've probably come across his work. So Rob is a really interesting guy. He was the one who developed the idea of luxury beliefs. He had a book come out recently. So he had a tough childhood, and he worked his way out of it through the military, and now he's a very successful writer. And I have a deep amount of respect for him. I do encourage you to take a look at his work. But he says, look, it's easy for you, not me, but to be in favor of kind of a promiscuous drug set of policies because you can control your environment. You can choose you don't have the peer pressure, you don't whatever. And he sort of says, this is a tax on people who can't deal with the availability of drugs and low prices as well as you can. And I don't like paternalism for the same reason I think you don't like paternalism, but he sort of says, look, man, some people need a dad because they don't have one. And so I'm sort of updating my views on that. This is an area where I was pretty extreme on legalization, but I encourage you to have a look. Maybe you'll change your mind. Maybe you won't. But he's definitely made me think a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never come across his work. I'll definitely put that in the show notes, and I'll read some of it myself or listen to him speak on it, because I come from many different. I love dipping into that because when you think about human psychology and the way we think, psychedelics are probably the biggest shifters when it comes to changing our consciousness. And now there's so much hype around it and so much glorification of it. Instead of talking about it holistically and more fully and more honestly and saying, hey, let's look at all of it, not just the benefits. But that's the whole profit thing again. You go back to like, what's going to be your interest there?
Right. And that's the thing, right? Kind of what you were saying, and is that if you do deregulate it, then you're going to have this competition for the cheapest but also best experience, and who knows what the downstream consequences are. There's this other kind of issue that surfaced recently. I don't know if you've been following this, but there are some people who have been writing about how they go, some big CEO company goes on an ayahuasca trip and comes back and says, yeah, I don't want to do this anymore. And the claim is that this is sapping people's ambition, or is it just refocusing the priorities? But whatever it is, it's creating these big life changes. And I have no idea if that's true or not. But I will say, stuff like that does make me feel like, did the person going into the experience have full information about what was going to happen to the person coming out of the experience? Because can you make an informed choice if you don't really have a good sense of what the different outcomes are? And that goes back to your point about information and the role that the state might play, which is, do we not know enough about these so that people can make good informed choices? I don't know. It's complicated. I think we are a little bit like, as you're saying, we're at a kind of an inflection point.
Yeah, and it's hard to trust the companies that have a really nasty track record of manipulating data and propaganda around drugs for whatever reason. Ozempic's the big one right now, and I don't know if you've heard of Casey and Callie Means, but they're really interesting people. They were just on Joe Rogan yesterday, which is a big deal because he has such a broad platform. But one was an ex-doctor and one was he worked in the lobbyist field and sees how money's played inside of all these different FDA versus pharmaceuticals and who's being incentivized by who. And they're just showing the just mass degree of corruption inside of these agencies, these regulatory agencies, and where we're being educated with the upside down food pyramid, so we're being taught, and there's propaganda and, lies about what's healthy and what's good. And it's not good. So I don't trust that they're going to do a good job with the psychedelic renaissance, because I feel like it's in the same category of sickness, and there's more of a sickness underneath the whole thing. But it's an interesting subject, of course, because it's going to shape consciousness more than ever.
Yeah, it's gonna. Yeah, potentially has big effects. But I agree with you. I mean, again, having spent time with economists and learning about so-called regulatory capture, where you look at the incentives within these agencies, mostly federal, but other agencies as well, and particularly as it intersects with the research environment. Now, having been in the research environment and seen that firsthand, I mean, part of me feels like it's amazing anything gets done properly at all, given the incentives involved. But yeah, I think my baseline is the same as yours, which is, man, the incentives are so strong, particularly big pharma, because the money is just, there's just so much of it. You have to look very carefully at the incentives. And that's really tough because, you look at the scholarly literature and then, how do you account for the fact that all of these findings that came out the wrong way got suppressed by the granting agency, whether it was federal or one of the big pharma guys, and then it makes the analyses more difficult, not impossible, but more challenging. And then distilling truth is, it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, probably more now than ever. It's hard to sift through so much information, but over the years, you've been doing this a long time and studying this field. What are some of the big paradigm shifts that you went through as you learned about this field? Like, were there huge paradigm shifts, or was it a slow evolution for you, or were there moments where you're like, wow, that was pretty interesting?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I would say it has. I would say it's more evolutionary than quantum, because, and the reason that is I do actually think that the baseline principles, evolution by natural selection and the computational theory of mind, gives you domain specificity or functional specificity, the idea that organisms consist of specialized functional parts for reproductive success. Just those set of guide rails on hypotheses they're so powerful that, yeah, of course there's room inside that space for discussion. And of course, some literatures have not held up, right? So when I started back in the day, there was this literature on so-called cycle effects where, people's sexual preferences in terms of sexuality would change depending on where they were in their ovulatory cycle. That work has not held up very well. Was that a quantum shift? Not really. It was just like one branch of the research that just didn't work out all that well. I will say that there's been an increased merging of evolutionary psychological approaches with people who are in economics and behavioral economics. That's been nice to see. So that's been one additional sort of arrow in the quiver. I think that's been really helpful, if for no other reason than it's forced a lot of people to read some game theory, which is very helpful in understanding evolutionary dynamics. Um, I think to a large extent, we were affected just like others were in terms of the so-called replication crisis. And so there's been greater attention to sample sizes, statistical methods, and gathering data from more than just people in, sophomore classes and elite institutions. So a broader sampling. But I wouldn't say that too much of the bedrock principles have stayed the bedrock principles. There's been, as always, there's a little bit of a change in emphasis. So with David Buss, there was a lot of emphasis on mating. With my advisors, there was an emphasis on cheater detection and social exchange. With Daly and Wilson, who were also important founders of the field, they were very interested in families, so step parents and so on. And then, the field changed a little bit. For a little bit, there was a lot of interest in cooperation groups. I did my graduate work on cooperation groups. But by and large, the underlying principles haven't changed. And that's because they're no different from the principles that you see in biology in the 30s. So it's, we've had decades to kind of come to terms. The biggest surprise to me, as I sort of alluded to earlier, in some ways is, the negatives, but it hasn't really taken off. There's tons of people in psychology who still are very happy to do their work without sort of what we think of as paying the debt to an adaptationist argument. So what's the underlying function of the psychological system that you're talking about? There's a little bit more now, some arm waving. Well, this would have been adaptive because X, Y, or Z. Okay. But the field has certainly persevered and it hasn't grown. I would say there's some areas where, you're much more likely to see an influence of evolutionary ideas than in the past. Science is slow.
Mm-hmm.
Science is slow. When I took my first sabbatical, I spent a lot of that time reading books about the history of science and to some extent the philosophy of science, because I was trying to figure out, why is this taking so long? And the answer was, it always takes long. There's some exceptions, some stuff, it's oh, but the big things, some guy comes along and says, you want to wash your hands after doing an autopsy before you put your hands inside another patient, and they laugh at him. And 50 years later, it's like, oh, that was a good idea.
Yeah.
It takes that long,
It's awesome. What do you think about the institutions right now, the colleges, and them looking at them as you're an economics background? How do you feel about them right now? I can see there's obviously some issues inside of these institutions.
I mean, there's two important pieces of that, I think. So there's the sort of the political piece, and then there's the epistemic piece. In both cases, I think can I say shit show on your?
Oh yeah, anything you want.
Yeah, shit show. Yeah, both are shit show. So in terms of the scholarly piece, and people have said this, people have tried to have noticed this for a long time, but the incentives are just so dumb. Because publish or perish, yada, yada, yada. You get your friend to review your paper, you get into a good journal, and there's no penalty for doing, it's not quite true, but almost fraudulent work. I don't know. You look at the Claudine Gay case where turns out she plagiarized so much and she's punished by having a job that has less work to do for a 7-figure salary. It's like, I'll take that punishment any day, So that, I remember one of the first times someone said to me something like, well, I read this thing and it was in a peer-reviewed journal, so it must be true. My view of that is that barely moves my needle on whether or not something is true. I don't want to say, if anything, it moves it down. That's probably not quite right, but it doesn't, if you're a good Bayesian, right? If you're just trying to figure out what the probability is, it moves it a tiny bit, maybe, but so much stuff gets published in peer-reviewed journal, which is so obviously false. And you get these nice analyses by people like Ioannidis, who just goes through and is like, yep, statistically half of these things got to be wrong. So there's a big problem with truth seeking, at least in the social sciences. I know less about what's going on in the hard sciences. I assume those are better, but I don't know. Medicine doesn't seem to be doing great. And as you were saying, the nutrition literature, every time you look into that, it seems like it's a basket case. But then, as we were talking about earlier, there's been complete institutional capture at the elite institutions. And what that's done is it's constrained the kinds of questions that people can ask, and it's constrained the way that they can talk about them. And it's made a pariah out of people who want to ask certain, kinds of questions. Again, race and genes is a big one, but there's others as well. There's lots of places you just can't look. You're just not allowed to ask those sorts of questions, and that's bad. The publication stream is bizarre, right? Like the government pays me to do research and I get a lot of money for that. And then a journal comes along and gets people to review it for free and then charges people $50 if they want to look at it. Like, wait, what? So back a long time ago, when John Tooby and I talked about this question, this is years ago before things really got bad, he said, and I think he was kidding, but it was a little hard to tell. He said, he said, aliens have definitely infiltrated the United States because it's clear, and this is kind of like that new series in the book, originally, The Three Body Problem. He's like, look, aliens have come in. They don't want us to do good science, and so they've developed institutions that guarantee that good work will not be done. So he's like, look at the NSF and the NIH. No one can submit a grant there for something that's truly groundbreaking. You've got to just do the next incremental step. You've got to be going 5 miles per hour or you're out the door. You're not doing the fashionable thing that builds on that genius's thing. Not interested. And I think there's been some nice audits of the review system, which suggests that it's not a very good review system. So yeah, I don't get me wrong. Again, I don't want to be a Cassandra. I don't want to be negative. I do think that science is the best way we have to figure out what's true. But I think that the way that we've structured science, particularly our universities, is not good for truth seeking. I don't know. I think it's funny, I don't know if the name James Lindsay means anything to you. So yeah, so he and his team, they submit these papers to these journals and they get in and they're jokes. And
yeah,
I thought, okay, this is it. That those fields have to they're gonna just turn it, they're gonna say, okay, we're done. You caught us. And instead they got punished. It's like, what? No, those fields are doing fine. Like, wait, we know it's all pretend, and yet you guys are still doing your thing. So that tells me again that's like a fairly serious structural problem with the incentives involved. And look, I don't have a great solution. One thing is, we should probably get rid of the tenure system. We should probably get rid of publications from Elsevier and those big guys. We should probably punish scholars who do bad things. I've seen lots of cases of various levels of fraud, and some of and also just no one really cares as long as you got the right politics. I mean, the Claudine Gay case I think is interesting. As long as you got the right politics, like, yeah, you were bad, but meh.
Yeah, and it seems like you said with James Lindsay and people that buck the system or reveal the system, they get punished or they get repressed or whatever the harassment is. I mean, some people lose their monetization on their YouTube channels, if you want to call it that. They get fired from the colleges. So it's actually an attack on anyone who questions the system being broken and incentivized for these reasons. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on an action instead of it being the alien idea. What about cultural engineering and social engineering and thinking about a communist, Marxist, whatever the thing is, the ideology that wants to infiltrate the indoctrination systems, which are now called education systems? I think of them now as like institutionalizing you and getting a young group of people to come out thinking a certain way, which shapes the whole culture, right? I'm always curious about social engineering, and usually they use the psychological and social sciences to then manipulate the data or the algorithms, and it's very fascinating. I'm curious your ideas on that.
Yeah, it's another great question. If I had to put all my chips on a square, I would put them on the new University of Austin, not the University of Texas, the University of Austin, this new entity which has emerged, because they seem to have different software operating system running the show, which corresponds more closely to the kind of values I think you have, Steve Pinker has. I don't know about James Lindsay, but people like Peter Boghossian, people like that, who open conversation, say anything, argue about ideas, but not at people. There's no moral weight, what they're trying to do there. And I think who knows, but I wouldn't be that surprised if people who come out of that environment turn out to be incredibly valuable, both as scholars, but also in what I call the real world, right, in industry, because they've been trained to think it's not biased by, and this goes all the way back to our prior conversation about the payoffs, right? They're getting payoffs for being truth seeking as opposed to just, because the whole idea of that place is you don't get a negative payoff for having a belief that everyone else doesn't have. And if they can get that to work, I mean, I think that's how some scholastic societies were. I mean, I wasn't there, obviously, Greek philosophers, but you sort of have the sense that it was this time like, okay, is your brain like a cave? I don't know, maybe. Is a man a chick? I don't know, whatever. So like the thing about that is it provides a model that maybe will show that with an operating system that corresponds relatively closely to Enlightenment values, a truth-seeking, a tolerance, what the academy was supposed to be. You show me your data, I show you my data, we both look at the data, we're like, oh, my belief turns out is less likely than your belief. I guess I have to update my belief. That's hard for humans. It's easy for Vulcans, but it's hard for humans. But I think that agendas like that one, I mean, I again, that's where I would put my chips. I'm not saying it's our last, it's not like Babylon 5. All my references are science fiction. It's not like it's our last hope, but I think it's the beacon. That it's a way to at least start talking about what would it look like to have an institution which was not captured by these ideas, that was not infected with these Marxian things, because it's very Marxian to, the whole Lysenko thing, right? It's to say that the politics and the science are one, man, that's when you really have to worry. And that's, I don't like to exaggerate these things. Yeah, we're not moving towards another Holodomor famine because of the science being infected by whatever ideas you want to talk about. But it's not that. Like, there again, the Lindsay case shows that a lot of ink is being spilled for completely, and what's not being done in virtue of that effort being expended on valueless prose. I don't know.
Yeah. Is that university in Austin, are they up and running, or is it being developed, or?
I think they just matriculated their first class, if I remember
Interesting.
what I saw correctly. Yeah.
That's good. Maybe they can
Yeah.
build a nice model and hopefully represent something that can be scaled, and hopefully I think people are thirsty for that, right? It's like there is a lot of people that want truth and want to be educated on how to think, not what to think. And so I think there's a market for it. It's just a matter of not being captured by the incentive structure that's so
Yeah.
overwhelming right now,
Right.
and
I agree with everything you just said, but I'm very optimistic, and mostly because of the people who are involved. These are smart people who have their eye on the question of ideals. There's other elements to it, right? So they've noticed the bureaucratic bloat that causes such problems. At Penn, I mean, it was ridiculous, the growth of bureaucracy and how much time and resources. I mean, how much of your time do you wind up doing research, and how much are you just filling out compliance forms? Like, okay, I mean, look, I'm not saying we shouldn't have some kind of culture of conformity or whatever, but yeah, I think that I think if they can build a model, I think what you said is exactly the point. Is that my sense is the current generation coming into out of high school into college, they're sort of done with the rhetoric. They're like, look, can you just teach me stuff and not? I don't want to. At least there's enough of those people around, and there's enough parents of people like that. That if they can get the secret sauce, of course it's going to be bumps, and it's always hard to get a new thing started. And man, they're up against there's going to be plenty of people who do not wish them well.
Sure. And there's always the disgust factor helps those tipping points too, where the culture is just like, all right, why are we, smoking in restaurants?
Right.
The younger generation isn't going to put up with that, or they're going to be sort of turned off, hopefully, by it. And I'm an optimist when it comes to that too. I have a question that I ask all my guests. It's, if you're going to die today, what would you want to share that would be most important with the world, and maybe even with your family?
Oh wow, that's a pretty big one. I mean, I guess I'm influenced a little bit by this conversation, which is to say that we've talked a little bit about how the institutions of science are failing and so on, but to my dying day, I will still believe in them. that the way to discover truth, which really is, I think, the most powerful way forward for humanity, is to use these tools ethically. And I don't think we should give up on them. I think we should keep trying.
Cool. So stick to seeking the truth. It sounds like.
You know,
That's
it's
awesome.
tough and free. I mean, I think, I mean, part of this is personal too. I mean, when people are not truthful in so many different contexts, there's untold harm. And again, we don't have ways to punish people properly for either not telling the truth or not pursuing the truth. And in some ways that's good. Like, you know, I believe in free speech and that's great. But man, the value of what's true, it matters just so much, particularly in today's age, because, you know, Mark Twain, right? The lies get around the planet before truth has a chance to put his pants on. That was a wise remark. It's not a coincidence, right, that Harvard has that word as its logo, Veritas, right? Like, they had it right there. They just aren't doing it right.
Right. And to uphold that Constitution, to keep the freedom of speech and to keep the elements at its core, we need to keep that thing around, or at least some of the principles, because people are being duped into believing that we don't need to have the freedom of expression, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, and as you said, man, once you have a bunch of people who claim to have, you know, cornered the market on what is information, what's misinformation, man, I mean, George Orwell saw that coming, and he was basically right about where that winds up. That scares me, right? So
Yeah.
once you have persuaded people that you need a bunch of others, particularly in a government, to start regulating what can be said, is, I mean, down that road, my friend, that's what scares me. People have talked about, you know, this threat to the republic, that threat to the republic, but that to me, I mean, of course, we need to figure out how to get people to vote properly, and you know, we need a clean transfer of power. Those are important elements. But man, once a government gets in the business of regulating what counts as misinformation and can punish people or simply restrict information flows, oof,
Yeah.
that scares me. I'm an optimist, but I also have some genuine fear.
Yeah, that's a good concern to have, I think, is authoritarianism. And we've seen it go bad in the 20th century. So it's not like it's far from us to look back and go, how did they get there? And we're close to being on the edge of with these super technologies and this information age. It's like it's very easy. We saw during COVID to silo information and to amplify certain narratives and to suppress a narrative. And then all of a sudden you have people that are very righteous because they tap into that primal element of ourselves. And next thing you know, people are sticking other people into a camp. And it could get nasty quick. So I hope that we don't fall into that prey. But
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, Americans are funny. We've had no American alive today has had a relative who, holding aside a couple little things, but looked at the government and really thought that the republic was in jeopardy. You know, whereas lots of people live in countries where, you know, in living memory there was a coup, and so I think it's easy to forget. You know, I like that line: "Every country is 3 meals away from a revolution." I mean, I don't want to be like a Burkean conservative or whatever. I mean, I am a little bit, but just to say, like, it's easy to forget how fragile civilization is, particularly if you haven't been in a position where you're looking at fall apart up close. And God forbid anyone has that, because it's no fun. But it is easy to forget that, you know, a functioning society over human evolution is very rare. You know, to be able to just walk around wherever we want, not worry that the next guy over is going to hit us with a club and take our stuff, like, that's a precious gift. Most people didn't have that. And it makes you forget, you know, it's not that hard to tip civilizations over. I mean, again, you know, we're having this discussion as a hurricane is making its way to hit the west coast of Florida again. I pray that everyone there will be safe. But, you know, one of the main things that you see is not let's batten down the hatches. It's how do we prevent the collapse of civilization in areas where there's no longer any centralized control. That's a people problem. Don't get me wrong, the storm's a problem too, but there's a people problem too. We're just hurricane away from at least localized chaos.
I agree. We're so vulnerable, we're so advanced, but yet more vulnerable than ever for something so quickly to happen, whether it be a grid going out or information warfare. There's just a lot of destabilization on the merge, and it's like freedom we have taken for granted, especially the people, like you said, we're a very new country, so we don't have a deep history of understanding how we got here. But
Totally.
it's fascinating. I hope we'll see. It's going to get weird for sure.
It's going to get weird. AI is going to make it even weirder.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your time today. It's been fun chatting with you. And is there anywhere you want people to find your work?
I write on a Substack at Living Fossils. Would love people to check that out. That's mostly where you'll see my stuff. Obviously, there's the book, Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite. There's another book called The Hidden Agenda of the Political Mind. And I'm trying to finish up, barely started. Look for it next year, called Phenomenal. No publisher yet. But for the moment, check out Living Fossils. See if you like the stuff. Enjoy it. It's free.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.